Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. I'm your host, Matthew Hawkins, along with my co-host, Ed Carbajal. And on a weekly basis, we plan to bring you the biggest news and interviews in the world of combat sports. Ed, got a busy night of PFL fights, but we still got the show going. How you doing, my man?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm actually rewatching. New York is on network now, and the prelims for the Chicago event are live on Facebook now. And then the main event's going to be on probably when we're wrapping this up. But this week's guest is actually an old training partner of mine, a good friend of mine. Haven't spoken to him in a while, and coincidentally, I saw found out he's not only is he an author of a book that he mentioned once when we were training, but it's an Amazon bestseller. Dave Greenberg. He wrote "Sit Down, Shut Up, You're Going to Win This Thing." I'm really happy to help him talk about his book. What's up, Dave?
Hey, Ed. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's a great, great opportunity, like I said, and nice meeting you, Matt.
Oh, what happened to Matt? Oh, we lost Matt. He'll jump back in. He knows how to get back in here.
All right, cool.
Anyway, a lot of stuff that came to mind when when you announced the book. I mean, I was so surprised to hear about it. But the thing initially that shocked me was because I remember us sitting on the mats talking about it. We were talking about it. I remember we were both blue belts. It was after rolling. I don't know if we rolled with each other or what. And it was I think it was after you were coming back from being hurt. I don't know if it was from I know there's a significant car accident that's probably in the book.
Right.
I can't recall that far back because it was a while ago. What was it, like 2007, 2008?
The car accident was then, yeah, but then there was another accident, which is probably we were rolling after the second one. So I took like a crazy fall playing paintball, which was like, I don't know. I wound up herniating 4 discs in my spine. My foot went paralyzed for a year.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's been quite a journey, my man.
So just before we go reminiscing and stuff, let folks know what the book is about. I mean, obviously, you fought when you're training with us back in North Brunswick. You fought in Atlantic City.
Yep.
You train MMA fighter, and from what I gather so far, from what I've read and what the synopsis says on Amazon, which by the way, there's a link to purchase it in the bio of this video for folks watching. Just let folks know what the book is about as far as how MMA and your experience in martial arts helped you get through stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, martial arts has kind of shaped my life, like probably since I'm 13 when I started wrestling, right? And the way the book is kind of formatted is the first half of the book is kind of this like lead up to my first amateur fight, and every possible like faux pas or crazy like accident or even injuries along the way kind of led up. Like no fight camp goes so smoothly, right? And I just kind of in my own weird life have had pretty bad luck if you kind of just take it at face value. But I've always seen those opportunities to kind of see what I'm made of and to kind of progress past those things. So I don't let what's the saying, right? Like it's life is more 90% of actually 10% of what happens to you, 90% of how you react to it, right? And so the first half of the book is kind of like getting to the fight, right? And then through the fight. And like I said, there were like many challenges like to even make that happen. One, for instance, was like, you'll know, right, that when you're booking a fight, your trainer more or less is supposed to be the one to book you the fight, right?
Yeah.
And I went behind our trainer Brian's back at the time, and I booked a fight in Atlantic City without telling him, and I wasn't even training that consistently at the time, right? And so there's another saying where it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission, right? And so I was really testing that. And so, Brian's kind of nonchalant answer, Brian's kind of a cool dude, right?
Yeah.
Eventually tell him, he's like, oh man, don't worry. You can get out of those things, no problem. And I was like, oh, no, dude, I want to fight. And he's like, yeah, you're not ready. I was like, yeah, but I will be. And so he asks, of course, like when the fight is. And it's only 2 months away. And he's like, dude, there's no way you're going to be ready. So long story short, I'm able to convince him to let me fight. And, then, all the drama that ensues from there. The second half of the book is kind of, so like I essentially set it up where like all these challenges to get through the fight, I barely get through that fight, right? Like I take a beating. I never took a beating so bad in my life, right? And then at the end, after like barely winning a fight, I, a split decision amateur fight against an 0-1 opponent, right? Like it doesn't get any like the skin of your teeth more than that. And at the end of it, I'm like, and that was the easy stuff. And then I like go dive into like some really heavy stuff, right? So like the car accidents one, that other second fall I was telling you about a little bit, but also like I've had some pretty crazy trials in like, just growing up in my academic career, right? Like, so, I mean, I almost dropped out of high school. I missed over a year of high school. And then I come back to graduate school to graduate at the top of my class and like earn a commencement speech nomination. And like, it's just to kind of show that like, even if you're down, you're not out, right? Like to use a fighting metaphor. And that's come up many, many, many times in my life. And martial arts kind of helped me to realize that when I'm down, that you're not out, right? And so, I'll shut up now because I tend to ramble on, and I apologize for that.
No, you're fine.
So, yeah, and then like sprinkled in, like there's funny stories, right? Like, because, like I said, I have kind of bad luck, but also kind of like weird luck, right?
Yeah.
So, it's pretty self-deprecating, or at least I try to be, where I'm making fun of myself the way. And like, I guess to kind of, fill in the picture a little bit better, I grew up to kind of this nerdy kid, right? Like a lot of us in martial arts, we get picked on. That's one of the things that drives us to martial arts. And I'm probably no different there, but I was probably more nerdy than most. And so it's in a way, it's kind of like how this nerdy kid, even / nerdy adult, right, found his way to that cage fight and found a way to win, like even when everything was looking against me. So
let me ask you something about the fight, actually, because I did some research on it, obviously, because it was a while ago.
Right.
What's funny, we just had because the academy moved, where we're still in North Brunswick, but we're at a bigger location and stuff now.
Right.
And but those posters from those fights, Brian used to keep those and hang them all over.
Okay.
And we recently took them down because we had like a birthday thing or whatever. So the one that you're talking about, the one in Atlantic City, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I feel like the stuff online might not be accurate. Because is it just the one fight, or you had? I could have swore you had two.
No, so I was training for that I signed up for another fight. I was training for a second fight, and when I took that spill playing paintball, was in the middle of my training, right? So I was supposed to fight in Philadelphia under New Breed again.
Yeah.
There's actually a whole crazy story about that. So I mean, the guy Scott, the owner, was like gracious enough to like give me the opportunity to fight the first time, even though I probably wasn't credentialed enough. Then, I had that crazy car accident and finally make my way back. And I reached out to him when I was like back healthy again, asking him, I was like, back, like I had this crazy car accident, I'm back healthy. Is there any way that like I could fight again? And he tells me this whole story. Is like, kid, like, it's a corrupt business. And I had a full shop or something. And I was like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So I'm like, okay. Like, I was like, well, can you point me in the direction of a different fight promotion? Like, I know it might be a competitor, but if you're not in it anymore, can you help me out? He's like, they're all corrupt, kid. And I was like, okay, well, all right, thanks for your help and your time or whatever, right? And so eventually calls me back like maybe 2 weeks later, and he's like, yo, Greenberg, right? That back to that crazy fight name, nickname that stuck that I didn't like. He's like, yo, Greenberg, I just want to let you know that like because you had so many supporters last time and your comeback, he's like, you inspired me to open up shop again. I was like, whoa, okay, cool. He's like, we're going to Philadelphia. He's like, I'm going to put you on radio. He's like, you have this crazy comeback story. It's like the car accident was like pretty bad, right? So I was like shattered from the waist down, 5 breaks in my pelvis, broken femur, like your thigh bone. It's like the hardest and most painful bone in your body to break. And so like come back from all that, right? So the dude's inspired. So like, I'm telling him, I was like, man, I was fortunate where I had like 100 supporters out for that first fight. Felt like really humbled, but like knowing that this was a comeback, like I had double the amount of interest. I'm telling the promoter this, and he's really excited. He's like counting on you for a kid. And then, like I said, so I was playing paintball at my best friend's bachelor party. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been so like risky playing, paintball in the middle of a fight camp. But my best friend only gets married once, and so, so playing paintball, I take the spill. And I have to call him up, and I'm like my foot goes paralyzed for a year, right? I'm obviously not fighting if my foot's paralyzed, right? And so I call him up, and like he blows a gasket. He's like, "Are you kidding me?" He starts cursing. He's like, "Are you kidding me?" He's like, "I put my whole life savings into this. I was counting on you for all those supporters." And I was like, "Man, I didn't do this on purpose. I didn't want to be paralyzed on purpose, right? Like, if I could fight, I would fight." But so in other words, like to add insult to injury, like this guy she's like, "You completely ruined me. Like these are all my life savings." Like, I was already feeling bad enough about like being hurt, and now I was like feeling extra bad for like having to like, I don't know, it's not like I told the guy, count on me, that you could rest all your financial, investments on me, but it's crazy.
Well, I mean, I'm sure Matt goes to a lot of regional and local stuff out west, right, in Cali. I'm sure you know a few promotions that no longer exist because of the promoters' shadiness.
Oh yeah, I mean the guy wasn't necessarily lying to you when he was talking about promotions being shady. But getting back to when you had your first fight, you had mentioned that you kind of did it behind your manager's back.
Yeah.
And how long had you been training before you basically had the guts to fight?
Right. So, like I said, wrestling since I was 13, and then I kind of had a weird way back into martial arts. So in college, I wound up taking like a personal defense class for a college credit, which wound up being like a karate instructor and his wife, like both black belts. So I wound up going to their academy and started studying karate, which is obviously not one of the tenets of MMA. I mean, sure, some karate practitioners, but not that many. So that was kind of like my first foray into traditional martial art. And so that I would have been like, 21, 22. And so I did that for like a year or two. And then I obviously knew I had to get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at 22, and then I fought at 26. So, and then like sprinkle in boxing and Muay Thai and all these things that, so 4 years of like on and off training before I eventually was able to work up the nerve to ask for the fight.
But you didn't, yeah. So you didn't just throw yourself. It wasn't like you showed up at the gym and a month later you tried to get it. You definitely. I know I heard you had said you had wrestling, but you had the experience then of hanging around a gym and being around some professionals and stuff for sure. A handful of years.
It's kind of funny too. When I first reached out to that promoter before like all that other drama, I'd been rejected by 2 other promotions, right? And so I was like, maybe I'm too green. Maybe like I was obviously going about it the wrong way. But maybe even back then I didn't fully know my manager should have done it. But so the guy was asking, I got like a second email and he's like, he asked for my credentials. So I told him what they were, right? I was like green belt in karate, blue belt in jiu-jitsu, training for X amount of years in wrestling, on and on, right? And but before I told him all that, I was like, I actually just started thinking about training. If you're so kind to give me this fight, would you also please tell me the school where I can begin my training? And he's like, and I instantly joked. I was like, I'm just kidding. Here's my credentials, right? He's like, so here's what I get. So he goes, great sense of humor, you're in. And I was like, holy crap, I'm in. So it was kind of a whirlwind at that point.
So when you then the night came, obviously, where you had your fight, and it was an amateur fight. I did watch a little of the video. It looked like you had shin pads on. It was full amateur rules.
Absolutely.
What was that experience like? As somebody who's been around the sport for 25 years but never fought myself, I always kind of like to ask people what the nerves are like, or what it just feels like to be there, and you see that clock counting down to your fight coming up.
Dude,
how was that?
It's a crazy thing. There's no better motivation I've ever found in my life than the accountability of like that day on the calendar showing up, right? Like any other deadline, you go to school or work, and sure, you want to do good, but like if you have to like miss a deadline, it's not the end of the world, right? But like this one, if I came in out of shape or whatever it was, like there's serious repercussions for like not making it, right? And so the feelings are like probably some of the most intense feelings I've ever had. I would say it's like a mix of like anxiousness and fear and excitement and I don't know, wanting to perform well, all those things mixed in. It's funny you say, so the amateur rules actually I felt like, who knows, right? I never got to fight professionally. Part of me still thinks I want one more fight because of all these crazy car accidents. Obviously not going to be a career anymore, but I think that the amateur rules all worked against me because I'm a wrestler, right? So I got to the ground, not allowed to strike to his head once we got to the ground. Then, I just told you that my primary striking art is karate, which is like I have really good leg dexterity. So I'm great at kicking to the head, but I was disallowed to do that too. So it was just like every rule that could have went against me from the amateur standpoint kind of did. And there's like a lesson in that, I think, too, right? Because then I could have said, well, I could have found an excuse in that to not win, right? But so what? Like, the rules are set up against you. Like, you still got to find a way to win, and you still got to make it happen. And I thought, before these crazy other things happened, and I didn't know that I wouldn't be able to continue, I thought it would just get easier then when I transitioned to pro. Like, I have the tools back in my tool belt then.
It's funny you're talking about the rules. You're making me think of I remember we had guys on the same card. I forget what year it was. It was the card was Combat in the Cage 7. I know because I still have the T-shirt. It was in Rahway, New Jersey, and it was Al Iaquinta fought on that amateur on that card.
Okay.
And the rule set you're talking about, I remember it even frustrated him because he washed the guy, but he took him down so easily, mounted him, and he couldn't do much else. So they were like, you can't hit him in the face.
Right.
And I remember Kenta looked at the ref like, I can't hit him in the face. What am I just supposed to do? And he just kind of like played with him on his chest a little bit, and then he just took his back and choked him out or armbarred him or something like that.
Right.
But I always find it odd that the amateur. I mean, we all watch pro more than anything, but when you watch amateur fights, it's like you have to ask the question: how well does it prepare you for MMA, and how many fights do you need to go pro? Like Jose Shorty Torres, who just signed with the UFC. I mean, he's got like 20 amateur fights or something like that.
Holy cow.
Yeah, I mean, did you follow him, Matt, before he went pro?
Not so much. I noticed him when he was in Titan and he started cleaning house over there. But see, the thing is that I mean, I haven't been to a ton of amateur events. I've been to a couple. Epic Fighting down in San Diego, and then there's Tough Enough event where we had Corey Turner on earlier on one of our shows, and that's where he started his career. And I don't recall. Tough Enough seems like that's in Nevada generally, and it seems like they basically have the same rules as pros. I don't recall them ever wearing shin guards. Maybe some of the matches did, maybe guys making their debut. But it seemed like it was pretty standard rules, and even Epic Fighting, they wore shin guards, but I don't remember there not being ground strikes and stuff like that. That might be more of an East Coast kind of thing. I mean, that's just a guess on my part, but the Tough Enough events I've been to, although amateur, were just as violent as a ton of events I've been to. So I don't know if that's a state by state rule or just a promoter's rule as far as what rules they use for their fights.
Mm.
So your book, I mean, again, this is a while back when we talked about it, back when we were training together. So I mean, it was just an idea. I'm assuming it was just an idea back when you mentioned it to me, Dave. But you self-published this, right? So like, how like from inception to putting the words on paper and having it printed, like what was the turnaround for that? How long did it take?
I mean, it's some way like I was probably writing this book since that car accident at some level, not actually sitting in front of a computer and doing the writing, but in the back of my head, kind of tying these stories together to hopefully come out with, a lessons learned type thing at the end of it. But, I would say in terms of like time in front of a computer, it was probably like a year and a half, 2 years, but like on and off, right? Like, so one of my character flaws is like I struggle with procrastination, right? I'm sure I'm not the only one who does. And so there were plenty of times where like a couple months would go by and like I hadn't worked on it, even though it wasn't like a writer's block per se, right? It wasn't like, oh, I didn't know what was next. It was just like, so the book by Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art, right? It's a play on words of the art of war. It gets pretty heavily promoted. I think it was even on the Joe Rogan podcast, even, the author, and it's been mentioned a couple times there, essentially helps you with the creative process and fighting against procrastination. And one of the big takeaways, I'm going to paraphrase here, is the guy said that, what every writer knows is that it's not particularly hard to write. The hard thing is to kind of get your butt in the seat and do the writing, right? And like after having done this, like I could totally attest to that. I totally agree. And so like so as you guys are now learning, right? Like I've been through some pretty difficult things, including the fight, but things beyond that as well. And like what I've kind of been saying of late is that out of all those difficult things, writing this book might have been the hardest, right? Because with those other things, right? Like you had a very clear direction. I was thrust into whether it was like a pit or a hole, and I knew that I had to climb out, right? But with the book, it was something that I wanted to do, that I wanted to hopefully pay for, to help a bunch of people going through whatever difficult struggle that they were. There were a couple memoirs that I read as I was going through some of those difficult things, and they helped me. So to be able to do that, but the thing was, right, like there was no deadline on it, right? It wasn't like, if I didn't meet this by a certain time, like my boss was going to be chewing me out. Like this was all on me. So it required, it's funny, harkening back to martial arts again, like the discipline of martial arts eventually kind of kept me going one foot in front of the other, if you will, to eventually get it done, because I just never wanted to be that person because obviously I talked about it, right? I talked to you about it. So I never wanted to be that person where like you would ask me like, hey, whatever happened to that book? And I would say, oh, half of it's done and it's in, my desk drawer somewhere, right? Like I just never wanted to be that person. And so I kind of just kept forcing myself to do the best I can, to just show up each day. And I think, again, going back to Stephen Pressfield and some of his advice, it's like he calls it turning pro, right? So just like get your butt in the seat and do the work, even if you don't think it's good right away. So And then as far as the self-publishing thing goes, so initially when I started this project, I was like a bit ego-driven, right? My ego got the better of me, and I was like, there's no way I want to do self-publishing, right? I thought it was kind of hacky, that, you know, it just seemed like, no, like it just, I don't know. It felt like, again, I'm more mature now and I don't have this view anymore, but back then I thought it was like beneath me, right? And so, and I started doing a little bit of research, and then I learned it was my ego talking and not anything else. And so in other words, like most of the things I learned pointed in the direction of self-publishing being better than traditional publishing. So when I first started, I thought, you know, with a traditional publisher, like I'm educated, right? I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy. I have a graduate degree in psychology. Like granted, I never was taught how to write a book per se, but I've done a ton of writing. And I think I have a story that nobody else has, right? Like I've overcome like these crazy things, and I've taught, you know, my graduate degrees in psychology, and I was working as a counselor. So I've been used to helping people, right? So when I take my crazy stories and I tie that to a way or a medium to help people, I was like, there's no way traditional publisher is going to pass on this. And then again, back to that research, I found out 10 years ago, a traditional publisher might have seen it as pretty hacky. But now in modern times, from what I've learned, is that most of them prefer that you self-publish first, because you can show that you can establish some sort of following, right? And I'm fortunate enough where, you know, in different areas of my life, through the martial arts community, through my graduate school and undergraduate communities and all the other sports I played, I have a following, and, you know, that I follow back. But, you know, I've kind of hoped to be the type of person that if anyone needed anything, I would be the type of guy that would help. And then when I eventually released this thing, they were all too kind to support me in something, right? And so I can't even fully take credit for, or the book can't take credit for the success that it's had on Amazon so far. More like kind of tacitly it's connected that way because of the way I've lived my life and wanting to help people, right? And I'm excited by that because I've never worked so hard as I have on this book. And so now that like I have the initial support by so many people, which I'm so grateful for, I'm excited to kind of show this other side of myself, right? Like no one's ever seen like the writer academic side of myself. And like I said, I worked really, really hard on it. And so I think that'll be kind of the next step, or at least I hope that'll be the next step into taking this to the next level. But back to the self-publishing thing. So some of the metrics, right? Like, so the traditional publishers, no secret, they take way more royalties than a self-publisher would, right? Okay. So, and I understood that even before I did the research, but I thought because of that, like they would do a better job of promoting your book. But in the research I found, and, you know, sure, it's not exhaustive, but all the different sources I did find at the time, at least, all point in the direction that on average for a new author, the first 2 years of book sales are identical, whether you go through self-publishing or traditional publishing. Huh. So I'm like, wait a second, like you're taking so much more royalties and I'm not selling any more books, right? Like it would make sense if like, okay, like you guys get it out there, I sell more books, I get smaller margins, but you know, that's not how it works. So it's like, okay, then I thought, I was like, okay, well, you know, what if I don't like how they're doing it and I want to supplement like the marketing, right? It's depending on the deal you get, but you might give up your rights to even market your own book, and they're not doing, they're not selling the book, let's say, to your ability or to your liking, say. So I was like, okay. Then going back again 10 years ago, if you'd self-published, from what I understand, most of these traditional publishers wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole. They're like, okay, like this person is decided to go this route. It's not exactly as professional. We don't want to be associated with that. Now, from what I understand, because of that following, they prefer you to self-publish first because then it's less of a risk for them. They get to know if this thing will take off or not. And so at least for me, you know, it's a personal decision. I would encourage anybody who's looking to do something like this, whether you're trying to publish in books or music or whatever it is, and there are self-publishing options for music as well. Do the research yourself, right? Like do the research, see what, you know, for one reason or another, it might be better to go through a traditional publisher if you have that option. One of the reasons I could tell you is that, you know, for me, I had to hire an editor, I had to hire a cover artist, I had to wow. Yeah, so I did these things like out of my own pocket, but also because again, I was treating the work and project very seriously. But, you know, if you have the opportunity to go through a traditional publisher, then perhaps they take off some of that work off your shoulders, right? And so it's not 100% one or the other. You know, like most things, you got to find what's right for you, I would say.
How long from start, or from, you know, when you decided that you were going to start breaking with pen and paper, did it take for you to get your book basically to Amazon where you could start selling it?
So it's super quick, man. So a year and a half, 2 years, like I said, from when I started actually writing. But like I said, it's not it's not so linear because I was procrastinating at different points, right? So a couple months would go by, I wasn't working on it. But from the point where like I was done with my final work, I was happy, the editor was happy. I uploaded the thing on Amazon and it was sold within a week. And so like that's another benefit that traditional publishers, like I think by the time I got to that point, it would have been another year before the thing went live with a traditional publisher.
Yeah.
So like turnaround is so much quicker, right? So
yeah, I do a lot of I've gone to a lot of like horror conventions and like comic book conventions for coverage for the site that I created, the Blogboard Jungle, the one that this YouTube channel belongs to. And I talk to a lot of writers there in general. There's I mean, it's funny how martial arts, there's one of the guys I talked to, he's self-published his own comic book or whatever, but the character's got a martial arts background and stuff like that. I think there's a video of him on this YouTube channel, so anybody watching can go check it out. It's called Day One the Comic. But he's like a Kali expert and jiu-jitsu guy too. But I mean, he said the same thing. He uses the same determination to go through, but he self-publishes, doesn't use anybody, does everything himself. And the consensus is these days that to self-publish, it's actually, like you said, it's more popular to do, and some people are willing to do it for a small price on the book, so long as the numbers make up for you know, for like if you sell a lot of copies for something that's $2.99, then it's all a win for them, you know, especially if they just do like a ebook only. That's why I had asked you if it was on Kindle as well. I mean, I have the hard copy here,
right. So
but,
I think it's going to be converted to like e-reader format in about a month, maybe 2 months. At that point, I am looking to make that happen as well. So just not yet, right? It's like this is my first project, so still figuring all this out. And you know, interestingly, right? Like so, you know, after writing my first book, I already have like a bunch of ideas and even some work down on my hard drive for a potential second book. Even though I just got done like kind of I guess singing the praises of self-publishing. For the second book, I am considering perhaps maybe going through a traditional publisher for a couple, like the reasons I was just saying, like, so I wouldn't have to hire a cover artist. I wouldn't have to hire an editor myself, and maybe being okay with taking less of those royalties. And like, I'm not sure, like I haven't figured that out yet, but you know, one thing at a time, as they say, right?
Yeah. So what are you watching now as far as MMA goes? Like what's your favorite you have a favorite promotion? I mean, me and Matt are kind of like all over the place. I guess I mean, is it fair to say we're Bellator guys more than UFC guys, Matt? I don't know.
I don't think that's fair to say, but I've always kind of rooted for the underdog, the one trying to chase the big organization. You know, and you know, for me, it's always about old school, and Bellator puts on the old school fight, so that attracts me big time. But no, I mean,
we're all old school now, all three of us.
Yeah, I mean,
let me jump in. Let me ask you guys then. So, like, when Strikeforce was like a force onto themselves, were you guys big fans of them when they were coming up?
Oh yeah, I watched Strikeforce I used to watch Strikeforce when it was only kickboxing on ESPN2, probably in the early '90s. The years slipped by, but I remember recording those on VHS. Didn't even know really what it was. It was just Strikeforce kickboxing, and I probably went to 10 of their events. I mean, I flew to Chicago to watch Fedor fight Brett Rogers. I saw Ronda Rousey fight 2 or 3 times live for them, including her first fight ever with them on one of the Challenger shows. So yeah, that's, I mean, I definitely was a huge Strikeforce fan, and I mean, remember that I think it was April of 2011 or 2010, the day I heard they closed. I remember where I was at. So yeah, that's kind of one of those things. I mean, but I go to a ton of UFC too. I mean, I just I'm going to Fight Week in a week and a half, and I got tickets for the 227 in LA. So, you know, it's one of those things.
One of the reasons I was asking about the Strikeforce is because one of the first events I went back to as a spectator after that car accident, literally went to the Izod Center. It's like by Giant Stadium. And I was on crutches, like I had a crutch down, like to get to my seats or whatever. And it was the card where Fedor lost to Bigfoot Silva. And Ed and I actually had a training partner on that card.
Yeah.
Casey McLean.
I was going to ask you about him. Yeah.
I was going to ask you. So I mean, what's up with Jay? You tell me, man.
He's coaching wrestling now. I forget where. But he tried fighting for a while. He switched over to AMA, the other AMA, Wilkie's, where all those big monsters train. for a while before he did the wrestling thing. But you know, not for nothing. I mean, we're not spring chickens over here anymore. So
You're telling me, man.
you know, like the sport is not kind. That's why like people that are starting, they're getting younger and younger. I don't know if, I mean, if Matt feels the same way. Like we like watching the old school guys. Wanderlei and Rampage just announced their fight.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of people think they should be retired, but we like watching them. But I can tell you, like, I mean, as somebody that just trains jujitsu 4 times a week now, in my old ass age that I always bring up, I feel like I bring up my age in every episode. I'm hurting right now sitting here because I trained last night. So I don't know how these guys do it, like where they just do nothing, train twice a day. I mean, I remember it's funny you're saying that because when I got off the phone with you last night, I remember when you were preparing for your fights, we used to do it with the team because it was you, Jay, Ricardo,
Yep.
Mike On, who still fights. He fights in Korea now. Remember Mike On?
Yeah, of course, man. Of course.
Yeah, he's fighting in Korea and Top FC. He's a purple belt now. I think he just got his brown belt, but he still stops by to train with us when he comes to visit his family in Jersey.
That's cool.
And I roll with him and I'm like, I feel the difference between a pro fighter. When I roll with him, I'm like this guy, if this was out more than jiu-jitsu rules, I'm dead. I'm dead right now. So it's just crazy. It's just crazy. But I mean, I went off on a tangent because you mentioned Jay. I was thinking about it last night though. Like you guys would you would do the training class, the training session that I've been used to doing for years. Yeah. And then when everybody would go home, I would stay and watch you guys, but then you guys would do a whole nother session right after that with the whole room is all slip and slide because everybody's sweat all over it already.
Yep.
So, I mean, I forgot. I spun away from the Strike Force thing, but yeah, go ahead.
So I was just remembering that because you guys talked about like the different promotions and you guys said you enjoy watching like the underdogs coming up. So my question then is like, do you celebrate, like, is it great that Strike Force was able to kind of cash out, that they got absorbed by the UFC, or do you think like, oh man, like we like having these other outlets for MMA, so like we don't want the UFC to absorb it all, right? Like, where do you guys stand on that stuff?
I mean, basically it goes back. The first one that was huge was when UFC bought Pride. And Pride was I mean, I loved watching Pride, but more importantly, I loved that every other month, basically, you had a totally different type of MMA event. You know, in January, you'd have UFC. In February, you'd have Pride. And then, you know, it'd just go back and forth. So it kind of gave you a different feel. And you always got to wonder about the matchups.
Right.
Then when UFC bought them, you always had the talk, okay, now the dream fights can happen. And for me, you know, I'm as Ed and everybody who's ever listened to a second of me talk knows, I'm a huge Fedor fan. So Fedor not coming to UFC and always hearing about him fighting Couture at the time,
right?
It never unfolding. Some of the matchups that I wanted to see just never happened. I never got to see Krokop fight Couture. And you know, it's hard to think about all of them. Sergey Karatanov never made it to UFC through that transaction, and so stuff like that kind of turned me off to it. I would prefer that we had, you know, if you told, you know, there's MMA nonstop all week long now, but a lot of it's not the bigger shows. If you told me every other weekend we'd have a UFC, a Pride, a WEC, a Strike Force, and a Bellator. Now, while we wouldn't have the talent to necessarily have like cards like we used to, in a perfect world, I'd love to see that. I still don't understand why UFC didn't take and create a Pride version of the UFC and have a UFC Japan.
Me neither, man. I'm with you there.
Even if they didn't keep the same rule set, I can't believe they didn't have they should have had a ring environment, just to be able to send fighters to and to have, you know, just to sell to different audiences. I would have
like almost in a way like how the beer companies are all owned, like Budweiser, Coors, they're all the same now, right? And so like in a way, but like everyone has their beer, right? So in a way, like you could have done that with the MMA if the UFC had chosen to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I would have figured out a way to do that with Pride. I would have had a UFC Japan or a UFC Asia. I would have had a whole organization that ran there, and then I would have had their champs meet the UFC champs, kind of like what they always talk about with Pride. I would have used WEC and really, because WEC had a nice little following. Reed Harris did a great job of running that organization, and I always thought that I would have kept the smaller guys at least for a couple more years under the UFC banner in that, and let them really build up and have their own cards. Because I feel like they got thrown into the UFC, and and a lot of those guys kind of just disappeared. I mean, you got guys like Mighty Mouse, who is one of the greatest martial artists of all time, but he just, although he was on a few Fox cards, he never really had that time to really build with the casual audience. It takes a lot for people to dish out $65 to watch somebody, especially a smaller fighter like that. A lot of people aren't into that unless you see them. So I would have done something with them. And with the Strike Force, I would have taken their Challenger series, and basically they're doing it now with the Dana White Contender thing. But I would have always had at least a Strike Force, kind of a Challenger series or something else for your kind of like your minor league system. Now they used the Contender series and LFA and some of those other, and Pancrase and some of the other organizations that, to do that. But that's what I would have done. And even now, I mean, I'm a huge fan of women's MMA, but I would. I probably would still just get really behind Invicta. I would have their cards. I would try to get their cards on some Fox Sports, well, coming up it would be an ESPN, but I'd really try to build an audience just for that. And then you bring their big stars and you put them on a big pay-per-view. I think fans are getting tired of paying out the amount of money that they are now. And I just think that there's just not enough stars. And I think that those other organizations, even if it was kind of built up on a resume that wasn't necessarily the strongest, it allowed for highlight. You had guys like, Vanderlei Silva, his record in Pride was what, like 26-2 or something like that. And half of those fights weren't against guys that were necessarily top 10, top 20, top 30, top 50 ranked guys, but it created a highlight reel and kind of this myth, the belief behind him that he was unstoppable. And I think that's where the MMA has kind of dropped the ball a little bit. I think having the highlight reels and building guys up, even if it's kind of a boxing model of it not being against the strongest competition, I think that's how you really build the mystique behind some of the guys and create the heroes and the legends of the sport.
So what do you think of like these new guys coming up now, like Darren Till and Brian Ortega and Mike, what's his last name? You know what I'm
Perry?
about. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I don't take it all from Ed, but Mike Perry is he's fun to watch. I know he's fighting coming up here on July 7th. I can't recall off the top of my head who he's fighting. I don't think he's going to be a superstar. Brian Ortega could be. He's going to have a hell of a fight with Max Holloway.
Psyched for that.
Yeah.
I think that's going to probably, very well could be the fight. It could be the fight of the year if both guys show up and put on the show that they're capable of. Who was the other guy you said? Oh, Darren Till. Exciting fighter for take away from his last fight. Him missing weight by as much as he did, he takes a step back in my book a little bit. But obviously he's going to be a threat down the line to anybody he fights, just based on his size. Now, if he's forced to move up to 185, then all of a sudden all bets are off. He's in there with guys like Chris Weidman and Romero and
that's what happened to Gastelum, right? Gastelum went up to fight and he fought Weidman, and like he saw that there's a difference in size here, even though he had some success against Weidman. Right? But
yeah, and he's had success at middleweight against other guys that are bigger than him. But Weidman's big. I don't know. I mean, he's an East Coast guy. I don't know if you've ever met him personally or
Oh my God, I mean, forget it. He's a monster.
He's
a monster.
Huge. When I met him, I was shocked that he was a 185 pounder. I mean, there's a few guys I've met.
He's 220. Like when I saw him, him and Vellante, Gian Vellante were at the I forget what the first time, whatever event that the first time Holloway beat Aldo for the title. They did a thing where they invited media to the Samsung place in the meatpacking district in New York, because that event was streamed through their 3D 360 technology. And so Weidman and Vellante were there as like to MC the event, have people come in and joke around and throw out like prizes and stuff. And I walked up the stairs between him and Vellante, and they're easily 220. Like they're monsters, both of them. And actually, I don't think you met his brother used to train with us, Witkowski.
Yeah, Ron.
Yeah. So Ron got his black belt from Matt Serra, and he's trained with Chris Weidman. And even when I talked to him about it, like just the mention of his name, and Ron's a really nasty black belt, he's a first degree black belt under Matt Serra, and just mentioning his name, he gives you an eye roll. Like, dude, it's a crushing experience.
I believe it.
Yeah,
I believe it.
yeah, they're monsters. But I mean, but nobody walks around. I mean, everybody usually tries to fight lighter than what they fought at. What were you, like 155er when you fought?
Yeah, so the amateur weight was 154, like super welterweight, right? And so it's kind of weird, right? Because like every scale that I stepped on, like getting ready for it, like I was calibrated, I knew where my weight was, and then I stepped on the state scale before like I had to do it officially, and I was like 2 pounds under, and I was like, wait a second. I was like, do they do this so that fighters don't miss weight, or like maybe like it was weird because like, or maybe the 3 or 4 scales I stepped on were all off in the same way, which seems weird to me too. But anyway, yeah. So I stepped on at like 153.8 after I knew I drank a couple. Like I stepped on back on the scale with a Gatorade to make sure I didn't go over, and then
you and Jay were 155ers, right?
Yeah. So, dude, I mean, you talk about like those old school days, man. Like for the first, like I said, I was 2 months into that training camp. For probably the first month, I did nothing but lose every second of every round, right? Like I just got my ass kicked for every second of every round. And the key to that was just like showing up every day, right? Like trying to find a small positive I could take away from it. Ice myself at night because that was the only way I survived. And then like by just showing up each day, then all of a sudden I got like my first takedown. I was like, whoa, okay. And then like it evaporated just as quickly as I got it. I was like, but I got it, right? And then like you just kind of build on those sorts of things, right? And so
yeah. You know it's weird though, like we're talking about the old days, like I mean, and we're obviously all follow the sport way back when. Matt and I talk about it every week, but one of the questions I had written down that I wanted to ask you as a whole, like from because back then, like the pay-per-views, when we trained together back in 08 or 07 or whenever it was, well, pay-per-views were like $30-$40 back then, Matt, right? Like it's like everything's cost more now, and it's not as good as it used to be. So I don't know. It's just like, what's your opinion on the state of the sport from like, because obviously we just talked about, Matt mentioned pride and everything, like how everybody had these mythical like promotions and stuff, but now it's like it's harder. I think it's harder to build stars because it's just so much out there. I think you have to bring the sport itself in a way. That's why I like the Pro Fight League I got playing in the background. I'm super interested in their new format. But I don't know. What do you think about the state of the sport now versus to when you were passionate about trying to get into it yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm no expert, right? But I do think that the market is saturated, right? Like you were just saying, like you can watch MMA almost every week. Like you could watch every week. You can almost watch it like 2 or 3 times a week, it feels like. So, I think because it's saturated, right, it's harder to get excited, and it's harder for them to build like a super stacked fight card for us to get excited about, right? And so, when you're spreading it all, in other words, they're spreading it thin. And by spreading it thin and then charging more, it doesn't lend itself to a good feeling from like a fan or viewer standpoint, right? But there are good cards that come around. Like, I mean, I'm super psyched. We talked about Max Holloway, Brian Ortega. I'm super psyched for Cormier, Stipe Miocic, right? Like, I'm super psyched for those. But like I used to remember, like we talked about back in the day, like the whole card, not even just the pay-per-view, you would just be like psyched for every single fight on the card, right? Because each one, it felt like had standing implications. Like each fight, you realize, like, man, the whole standing or the whole weight class could get shook up based on this one fight. And now it's just like I'm generally maybe interested in 1 or 2 fights on a card on average, right? And like maybe that's a harsh kind of estimate, but it's kind of the truth, right? So, and then as far as, talking about you guys, when you said you're more interested in like those underdog promotions, to be honest, like I never was so psyched for like the tournament status, like how Strikeforce did it with the heavyweights, or because it felt kind of, I don't know, I guess forced in a way. But I have to say, like, I kind of like the way this one's shaking out with Bellator, right? Like I find myself kind of excited for, Chael Sonnen Fader. Like who would have thought that would have happened, right? Like, I'm psyched for that.
Yeah, me too.
Well, that's the thing about it is you get, it's a fun matchup. The thing that got me into MMA and kept me into it was obviously I wanted to know who the baddest fighters in the world were and who could beat everybody and stuff like that. But it was kind of the freak show and just kind of the fun atmosphere of it, that it didn't have, not every fight had to be taken seriously.
Right.
The Chael Sonnen Fedor fight, that doesn't, other than some legacy stuff, which can be argued that they're too old, so it shouldn't even matter anyway, or stuff like that. I mean, nobody should ever look at these guys' career and not think that Fedor is the greater fighter career-wise. Maybe Sonnen will pull it off. I've said before that hopefully never happens, but it's stuff like that today they announced, and it's two guys basically in their prime, but it sounds like we're going to get Rory McDonald against Gegard Mousasi, champion versus champion fight in Bellator.
Yeah.
Now the UFC is doing that with Stipe and Cormier coming up here in 2 weeks, but for it to happen so quickly in Bellator is what I just think that's great. Too many times we wait around for that matchup to happen, and a guy gets hurt or a guy gets a loss. Maybe there's not just a whole lot of just strictly Bellator fans, but if there are, basically they're seeing two guys who they've never seen lose. Unless they want, and even if you're a UFC fan, those guys, it'd be hard pressed to find their losses.
Right.
I mean, for Rory, you're watching him fight Lawler, and Gegard was on, I think, a 5 or 6 fight winning streak when he left the UFC.
Right. Let me jump in for that Lawler Rory fight, dude. So I'm a fighter, right? And I obviously enjoy the fight as a fan, and all that. That fight was hard for me to watch. I was like, I can't watch them take more damage anymore. It was like, and I'm a fighter, right? Like I'm like desensitized to this stuff, and I was like, holy cow, these guys are kicking the snot out of each other. Did you guys get that impression? Like, it was hard to watch.
I was there for that. That was UFC 189, right?
Man.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't know you were there for that one too, but yeah, I was at both of their fights. So I've seen those guys basically kill each other for 8 rounds now, or 7.5 rounds. And I mean, that was one where you just knew that they were losing a few days off the end of their life in that fight.
Seriously.
You almost felt guilty watching it, but at the same time you couldn't turn around. And being old, like I said, going old school for me, it's Robbie Lawler. Seeing him win that fight and pull that out when he was behind on the cards.
Oh my God, with that split in his lip is so just nasty too.
That wasn't even as gross as like Rory's broken nose that kept getting punched in. Like I was like, oh my God, don't take any more of those.
Yeah, there was a graphic image on I remember it was the week after the image was floating around the web from that fight when I had gotten back from Vegas. It was actually because I was living with my ex at the time, and I think she found it and she's like, you got to see this picture. It's disgusting. And I looked, and it looked like somebody had a mask of Rory McDonald and they pushed in the middle of the face.
It was like blood streaming down it, right?
Yeah, it was really bad.
I think that's his logo now, or something like that, or something like yeah, dude.
I think it's his bobblehead or something, right?
Yeah,
do you have it, Matt?
Yeah, something like that.
No, somebody I don't know the name of the company, but some company made like a gypsum statue with that. I mean, it's handcrafted. I looked into it. It's not cheap though. I think it was like $200 or something like that.
Yeah.
But,
if you can't tell, Dave, look at Matt's background. I mean, he's got a lot of like really cool MMA related memorabilia.
Yeah, dude, and he has it like set up real nice too. Like it looks.
Yeah. He's got like Fedor's sweater and all that stuff.
That's cool. It makes my I have a George St. Pierre signed glove back there. It makes it look like rinky dink.
So you'd ask me about, so who are some of the fighters that you like watching? You had mentioned, you asked me about Till and some of the younger guys. And then you mentioned that you're looking forward to the Fedor Sonnen fight.
Yep.
If you could, if you had the money to buy a front row seat to watch any fighter fight live, who would it be?
Like, so active fighter then?
Active. How about active and then historical?
Well, so I don't even know how you categorize this one, but George St. Pierre has been like the dude that I looked up to like the most, like partly because of his story, right? He was bullied and found his way into martial arts, and I could relate to that. But also like the way he carried himself, like being a true martial artist, and that, he wasn't just a dude looking to get into a fight, right? Like, he's the guy I look up to the most in martial arts. And then like what he was able to do, like come back, go up a weight class, and like it came out after his fight, but was like fighting, I think it was colitis or some stomach issue the whole time. And then like finish Bisping, like granted, like maybe, like I'm a huge Bisping fan as well. And like some people say that, it might've been a harder fight against Romero or Whitaker, and I could see all that. But like still, Bisping earned that title, and he took the belt from the man who earned the belt, like right. And so like that, I was just blown away by. But so anyway, so George St. Pierre is probably A1, right? And then like a close second is Frank Yeager, man. Like, local guy, right, Jersey guy, but like that guy's fighting spirit, like his fights with Gray Maynard, like that whole series, like I don't know, man. Like if you were gonna show someone like what heart is in an athletic setting or something like that, like how do you not show like those fights, right? Like that was just. I don't know. And like he's a good guy too, right? Like he's like humble and like,
he's actually got a youth thing going this weekend at I Play America. It's like a youth MMA, like a family thing going on.
Like that's so cool. Like that he does that. Like that's so cool to me. So he's up there. And then like, I don't know, like historically, I mean, I go back like to the old school, right? Like to see like Hoist do what he did in those like first tournaments, like that's, come on, like as a martial artist, like especially like growing up as a wrestler, right? Like we were all in the wrestling room. We'd all wonder like who would win against like a boxer, a wrestler, or a karate guy. And we all, we were all wrestlers. So we'd be like, oh, the wrestler would win, right? Like that's all we knew. And I mean, obviously wrestling is an important tenet of martial arts, right? It's like one of the big three. And so like we weren't totally wrong, but like this Brazilian jiu-jitsu 170-pound guy who unassuming was going through everybody. We were just like blown away by that sort of thing. And then there's kind of an interesting story. So like I told you guys, I started wrestling and then I went to karate and then found my way to jiu-jitsu, knowing I had to study it, right? Like I knew that, submissions were a thing, even though I understood grappling from a wrestling standpoint. Like I also knew that I had deficiencies with like submissions and submission defense, right? So I go to my first class and it was on Long Island. So it might have been Matt Serra's, but for one reason or another, the advertisement that struck me was Master Mansour. It was Kyoto. He was a red belt under Helio, right? So it's pretty good advertising.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So like my first intro into BJJ was this guy Master Mansour, and like I said, red belt under Helio. So that's where I started my training. And I remember my first class. They let me go live because I had wrestling experience, and they paired me up with like a middle-aged, like overweight purple belt. And I was like in shape. I was like just out of college and like a former wrestler. And I was like, okay, like I know jiu-jitsu is a thing, but like I'm an athlete and this is a fat purple belt, sure, whatever these belts mean. And, and he's middle-aged, right? And I was like, all right, like I'm not even going to feel bad about beating him. And then I never got tapped out so many times in my life.
Yeah.
I must have been tapped out without exaggeration, like 20 times in like 2 minutes. And I was just like, okay, like I know I need something. Like it was the best thing that could have happened to me because I knew I learned in that moment I had something to learn, right? And so then I checked my ego at the door from that point forward, and I just kept learning the best I could. So
yeah, it's a humbling experience, man. Your first jiu-jitsu class usually is a very humbling experience. Didn't you do one too, Matt? You got up to blue or something like that? Didn't you tell me?
Yeah, it wasn't really much belts. I mean, I did a lot of jiu-jitsu, but it was just kind of more street fighting. It was with Mark Hall at the time, and he wasn't a jiu-jitsu guy so much.
He was just like yeah.
He was more of just a street combat guy. I mean, this is when it was no Valley Tudo, no rules. But I trained with a guy named John Munoz, who has a gym out here in Ontario, California, or Norco, California, and a guy named Rick Lucero, who was one of the first, I think, 10 American black belts in the country. And he trained under Joe Morera.
I feel like you had a humbling story though, that like you told me back when we were at the Garden for before 205 started. I thought you had a story like that. I don't know why I thought that, but it's funny.
I don't know. I mean, I just started boxing with Virgil Zwicker a couple weeks ago. Now I got a pinched nerve in back, and so taking up boxing at 39 might not have been the smartest move in the world, but I'm enjoying it, and I have plenty of humbling there every couple times a week. But
yeah, you just announced a fight. I saw you put it on Twitter yesterday or today, right?
Yeah, he's going to be fighting August 20th for the Platform League's S70 promotion. That's the one they have an event about every August for like the last 5 years, and that's the one where he talked about on our interview with him where Vladimir Putin came into the ring and gave him a championship belt and took selfies with him and stuff. So he's really excited about going back there for that. I'd have to look up the guy's name he's fighting again. It's a Russian guy. I think his record's 10-8, and he's a 260-pound rock of a human being. So Virgil's excited to get back in there. I believe he's talked to bare knuckle boxing about maybe trying to get into that too, and I think ACB still. So he's
Cool.
he's trying to wind down his career but get some big fights. And
I'm just making notes because I got to follow up on this stuff. Bare knuckle. ACB. Yeah.
but yeah, so he's stoked about that. And and then in the other MMA, like I said, we got the Musasi fight announcement today was crazy. And we
And
got Cowboy and Leon Edwards fighting in
so
Singapore this weekend for UFC. So
that's right. Yeah. I mean, talking about Darren Till, I feel like this guy Leon Edwards. I just wrote an article at MMA News about him because he said some comments to Yahoo Sports. It seems like he's been making these comments leading up to Saturday, kind of saying that, like, again, we just talked about old school guys and all of us, advancing in our years and stuff, and young Leon Edwards, 26 years old, is taking shots at Cowboy, saying that his time is done and he's old for the sport. And he's from England. I feel like he's trying to follow in Darren Till's footsteps just because Darren Till got that win over him. I don't know. Do you think he has a point? I don't know. I feel like Cowboy's not completely done. He won his last fight, so I don't know.
yeah, I mean, I don't think he's done. I haven't done a ton of research into the fight, but I think Leon Edwards will probably win the fight. I do think Cerrone's on the decline. He's had a lot of wars. It's not personally a fight that I necessarily would have signed for him. I'd be using him in kind of the Bellator model, and maybe giving him a Robbie Lawler rematch, or something like that. I'd have to look at maybe a Matt Brown. I mean, who wouldn't watch Matt? I know Matt Brown's out with injury right now, but Matt Brown, Cowboy Cerrone, definitely would probably bring some eyes to a fight. So that's the kind of stuff I would do. I mean, even like a Diego Sanchez. I mean, I don't, something like that. That's what I'd be doing with Cerrone. I don't think he's going to get into title contention. So I'd be just putting him in fights where he's fighting other guys kind of at his age and generation, and let him put the shows on. That's what I would do with him.
So with because they're gonna go live when we wrap this up, the Pro Fight League. Have you guys checked out the first event at all? That's the one I was there for it at Madison Square Garden, but we never really talked about it.
I watched it. You're gonna have to refresh my memory on some of the fights. But I remember it being entertaining. There was a lot of finishes. I remember that. I think all of them except maybe two fights had finishes. I know the second event prelims just wrapped up, and Brandon Halsey just finished his fight. Speaking of another great MMA wrestler, I went to high school with his family and a bunch of his cousins, so he's from my neck of the woods, and former Bellator middleweight champion. So he just won by TKO stoppage for a cut. So I don't know. I mean, the fights I've seen today, I watched most of the prelims earlier. And like I said, with all the fights going on, my mind's blank about the fights. The last show they had, but I do remember.
Did you check?
Harrison? Harrison was the main event, right?
Andre Harrison, yeah.
Andre Harrison, yeah. So he had a dominant performance, but I like what they're doing. I hope they're able to keep the momentum going, and they don't have any injuries and stuff that really throws the brackets or the round robin. I'm not sure exactly how they're doing it. It's not so much round robin. I don't know how they're going to do the second round matchups. I know everybody that's signed sticks with them, but do they just pull names out of a hat and that's who you fight, or
I actually have a breakdown of it at Front Proof Media you can check out. It might clear it up for you a little bit. So you can check it out. Plus, there's a link to their website which explains it better. Did you check out that event, Dave, or no?
No, I missed that one. So, but my question to you guys though is, like, with these new up and comers and like as saturated as the MMA market is now, do you think like this new breed has arrived where like the kids coming up are like mixed martial artists, that's their discipline, or do you think it's still that people are going to have a grappling bias or a striking bias, and you have to learn all aspects? But like, what's your guys' sense on that stuff? Where the MMA is at these days?
I think that you pretty much are going to have to just be MMA. I don't. I'm not necessarily. That's just the natural evolution of it. I don't think there's any way around that. I kind of prefer when guys lean towards a style. For example, we got coming up at UFC 2 226, the Cormier Miocic card is Gokhan Saki.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he's a world-class kickboxing champion. And I remember watching him 10, 12, 13 years ago fighting in K1 tournaments and through Glory and all that stuff. So when you get a real, somebody who's just an ace at their one art, a Damian Maya or a Fabrice Verdun or a, Sakuraba at catch wrestling or even a Josh Barnett, something like that. When somebody's just that good at one particular art, I really appreciate that. It doesn't always lead to the greatest success because then you reach somebody who's just able to nullify it enough. But
right,
most of the guys are.
Yeah, it's like an interesting wrinkle in the story leading up to it in a way.
Yeah, that's Cleo Roundtree's a solid fighter, and he's basically a stand-up guy too, but he's got some wrestling and stuff. So his fight with Saki will probably be fireworks. But yeah, I just when you see somebody who's, I don't know. If you were to say it was like basketball or something, it would be somebody who's not the greatest basketball player in the world, but they're the greatest shooter of all time.
Right.
So, it's like somebody like Steph Curry right now for Golden State. He might not be might not be LeBron James. He might not be Michael Jordan. He might not be Kobe Bryant, but he beats all those guys in 3-point shooting contests, or you get somebody who's a dunker, Dennis Rodman, who's, a rebounder. He was the greatest rebounder basically of all time. So they had their specialties and they kind of had their own niche where, for me, that stuff's cool to watch because you really see somebody who's really just a master of their craft. And in a sport like mixed martial arts, where obviously you're bringing all the martial arts together, I think it kind of brings that traditional feel to some of that stuff. When you get that, tonight for PFL, Kyla Harrison, it's not her last name.
Yeah, no, that's it. Kayla Harrison.
Kayla Harrison.
Yeah.
She was the gold medalist or a silver medalist, a gold medalist in the Olympics in judo. Yeah. So she's kind of like the PFL next generation Ronda Rousey. At 145, where Ronda also started her career. So I look forward to seeing how she looks. Somebody how they're able to bring that in because that she's going to have the throws and she's going to have the strength advantage.
And I agree. I mean, I think we're all on the same page. Like we respect and we like those guys that come from these solid disciplines and they're able to impose their wrestling, their jiu-jitsu, if that's what they're a master of or they hold a high rank in, and they're able to impose it on their opponent. That's always going to be cool to see. But as things evolve and change, I mean, you're going to get these super athletic guys that are that just know enough of everything to climb the ranks. But I think we're also seeing, though, as they get older, they know they still have to have a master of something. There's that saying about jack of all trades, master of nothing, and nobody seems to want to stick with that forever.
Right.
So, we talked about Brian Ortega at 226. I mean, he's a jiu-jitsu guy, but he's also the first guy that knocked out Frankie Edgar. So it's like, for me, I mean, he's one of the younger guys that I actually see him holding a title and being one of the future, MMA UFC legends rather. So
before or after his fight with Max, is he going to take it off Max or is it some down the line?
I see him winning.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I think Max wins the fight. I think he's going to be a little too crafty for Ortega in his first title fight, and I think Max will. Somebody's already been in some big fights.
Yeah.
Headlined some big events. I think he'll. I think he's going to be a little too crafty, but that's a good example of a fight though, where you basically have Ortega's a master of jiu-jitsu who's obviously his striking is solid, and Max is kind of that young mixed martial artist,
right.
Just kind of really, really good at everything. So, be interesting if Ortega gets him down on the ground. It could be fun. It's going to be a fun fight to watch. No
matter where it goes, I feel like it's going to be fun. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to talk about him too much because you just never know who's going to make weight, and I mean, we're 9 days away,
I think better than anybody, Matt. That International Fight Week is a cursed week in the last 3 years. So, like anything, expect anything, man, because you were there for 213, and I mean, come on, man. Like I was breaking your balls about it, but because it was like in a month's time, like it wasn't just UFC, it was like Bellator and UFC, everything Matt went to. everything that went to fell apart. Yeah.
Fedor Mitrione, followed by Shevchenko, Nunes.
Yeah.
To be fair, I mean, Max missed weight in his last weigh-in, but he was like super last minute. Like, and
they didn't let him finish. They didn't let him finish cutting either because New York's weird about MMA.
Yeah.
But, it's not a knock on Max. I don't. He's never showed that making weight in general is an issue for him. If anything, Ortega might be the one that's the bigger guy and could be the one coming in. But it doesn't even matter. It's not even that. It's
it could be anything, right? It could be
a sweaty Nagano walks up to the somebody slips behind him. I mean, at this point,
or Dolly gets thrown through a bus window, or who knows?
Yeah.
Like I said, I was walking into the arena when Mitrione had kidney stones appear in his body, so anything is possible to have a fight canceled.
Yeah,
it's gonna be a loaded event between that. Next weekend also there's or next Friday nights I'll be at Bellator 201. So we'll be doing hopefully the show. We'll come on right after the weigh-ins. I'm gonna try to get down there for those, and then we'll
it's
do
gonna be
quick
fun.
little preview and talk about those fights.
So anyway, we're at the end of the hour here, so we should probably wrap it up. Real quick, one more time for Dave. Sit Down, Shut Up. You're gonna win this thing. It's on Amazon. The link again is in the description of this video, and I'll probably put some stuff out on the Blogboard Jungle website along with this podcast episode. Am I leaving anything out, Matt? Where can folks follow us and stuff?
For us, I mean, you can follow us at Combat Hour on Twitter, at MMA Hawk 21 on Twitter and Instagram for myself, and for you at Carbazol on Twitter. What else? I think that's about it. Dave, do you have anything you want to plug or throw anything out there?
I mean, I'm just starting up my Twitter again, right? I've kind of been neglecting that, but it's at Meanberg, MEANBERG. So I will start to become active on that now. But honestly, guys, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to come onto your podcast. Like, it was a lot of fun. You guys have a good flow, and I think we're like-minded in how we're viewing the martial arts landscape these days. So it's kind of cool.
Definitely. Please follow us, iTunes. I mean, we're all over iTunes, Google Podcasts, Overcast, Breaker, Anchor. We're all over. So this audio will be all over the place by tomorrow morning if you guys need to hear it on the road and stuff. So please subscribe, listen, let us know you're listening on @Combat Hour at Twitter. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thank you, guys.